The hammering woke Theron at dawn, and for one sleep-stupid moment, he thought his dead wife had come back to finish the work he'd been avoiding. He lay there listening to the rhythm drifting up through the floorboards. 3 strikes, pause, 2 strikes, quench. Exactly the way Myra used to work 5 years ago, before the plague took her, before he built a shrine out of grief and called it loyalty. Except the dead don't typically break into forges to meet deadlines, and someone was definitely hammering downstairs. He grabbed a poker and descended barefoot and furious, ready to introduce whatever thief had invaded his carefully constructed emptiness to the concept of percussive consequences. What he found instead was an orc woman at his anvil, tall and green-skinned, finishing his backlogged orders with devastating precision. She didn't apologize. Didn't explain. Just looked up with unnerving calm and said, "Your tempering was off. I fixed it." Then she walked out into the dawn, leaving him surrounded by flawless completed work and one terrifying question: what do you do when someone refuses to let you stay buried? Welcome to Orcvale Tales, where we forge stories that hit different, stories about broken people finding each other in the spaces between grief and hope, stories that'll make you feel things you didn't know you were avoiding. And listen, if you're already feeling something from that opening, you know what that means. It means you're exactly where you need to be. Hit that like button right now, not later, now, because supporting this channel supports more stories like this, stories that don't treat you like you're stupid, stories that respect your intelligence and your heart. And subscribe, obviously subscribe, because we're building something here, a community of people who aren't afraid of complex emotions, who understand that the best stories are the ones that hurt beautifully. Turn on notifications while you're at it. Trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Now let's get into this story about a blacksmith, an orc warrior, and the difference between remembering and remaining. The hammering woke Theron at dawn, and for one sleep-stupid moment, he thought Myra had come back from the dead to finish the work he'd been avoiding. Which would be very on-brand for her, honestly. She'd always been terrifyingly efficient, the kind of person who finished projects before they were technically due and made everyone else look like they were moving through honey. He lay there in the bed above the forge, listening to the rhythm drifting up through the floorboards. 3 strikes, pause, 2 strikes, quench. Exactly the way she used to work when she thought he was still sleeping, back when mornings meant something other than another day to survive. Except Myra had been dead for 5 years, and as far as Theron knew, the dead didn't typically break into forges to meet deadlines. He'd gotten used to a certain kind of silence over those 5 years. The kind that pressed against your ears until you forgot what voices sounded like, until the only conversation worth having was the one you had with yourself or with the portrait of a woman who couldn't answer back. Wake at dawn. Light the forge. Check the coals. Never check himself. That was the routine, and routine was the only thing standing between him and the kind of grief that swallowed people whole. Metal didn't ask questions. It just broke or held. Simple. Clean. Safe. But metal didn't hammer itself, and someone was definitely hammering downstairs. Theron grabbed the first weapon-shaped object his hand found, which turned out to be a poker from the cold hearth, and descended the stairs barefoot and furious. His mind was already running through possibilities. Thief, probably. Bold one too, breaking into a forge in the middle of town. Maybe drunk. Maybe stupid. Definitely about to regret their life choices once he introduced them to the concept of percussive consequences. What he found instead stopped him 3 steps from the bottom. An orc woman stood at his anvil, tall and broad-shouldered, her green skin slicked with sweat and forge light. She was bringing down strikes on a half-finished blade he'd abandoned 3 days ago because he wasn't feeling it, which was his polite way of saying he'd stared at it for an hour before giving up entirely. Her movements were precise, controlled, each swing landing exactly where it needed to. No wasted motion. No hesitation. She worked like someone who understood that metal had a language and she was fluent. She didn't startle when he appeared. Didn't even look up until she'd finished the sequence, sending the blade into the quenching barrel with a hiss of steam. Only then did she turn, meeting his eyes with an unnerving calm that suggested she'd been expecting him. "Your tempering was off," she said, as if that explained everything. "You rushed the cooling." "I fixed it." Theron stared at her. At the blade sitting in the barrel. At the 3 other completed orders lined up on his workbench, pieces he'd been putting off for weeks. All of them finished. All of them, from what he could see in the dim light, flawless. "Who are you?" he managed. She wiped her hands on a cloth that wasn't hers, set down tools that weren't hers, and walked past him toward the door. "Someone who noticed you needed help." "I didn't ask for help." "No," she agreed, pausing at the threshold. Dawn light caught her profile, made her look half solid and half shadow. "But you needed it anyway." Then she was gone, footsteps fading into the morning sounds of a town waking up, leaving him standing in his own forge with a poker in his hand and no idea what had just happened. That night, after he'd inspected every piece she'd touched and found them all sickeningly perfect, better than his own recent work if he was being honest, Theron stood in front of the portrait that hung above his workspace. Myra smiled down at him, forever caught mid-laugh at something he could no longer remember. "There's a strange orc woman breaking into the forge," he told the painting, the same way he'd told it about his day every night for 5 years. "I think she's casing the place." The portrait, as usual, offered no helpful input. But Theron went to bed that night with something he hadn't felt in a long time, an uncomfortable flutter somewhere between his ribs that might have been curiosity or might have been the first stirring of fear that his carefully constructed routine was about to be thoroughly disrupted. She came back the next morning, which Theron had not been expecting and also had definitely not been thinking about since the moment he woke up, checked the forge, and found everything exactly as normal except for the nagging disappointment that it was exactly as normal. He was in the middle of reheating an axe head when the door opened and there she was, holding a dagger like it was the most natural thing in the world to walk into someone's workspace uninvited 2 days in a row. "The handle feels loose," she said without preamble, no greeting, no explanation for yesterday, just straight to business as if they'd known each other for years. Theron set down his tongs and took the dagger, turning it over in his hands. The handle was wrapped in leather, the binding tight and even, the pommel secured with a pin that showed no signs of wear. He tested the grip, gave it a small twist. Nothing moved. He tried harder, putting real force into it, half hoping to prove her right and half hoping to prove her wrong, though he couldn't have said which outcome he actually wanted. Still nothing. The dagger was solid. Perfect, even. Better than most work he saw come through. "It's not loose," he said, holding it out to her. "It feels loose. Feelings aren't a structural assessment." "Check again." He checked again, because apparently they were doing this now, whatever this was. He examined the tang, the pins, the way the leather sat against the wood underneath. Everything was exactly as it should be. More than that, actually. Whoever had made this dagger knew what they were doing. "It's fine," he said, and then because he couldn't help himself, better than fine. "This is quality work." She nodded as if she'd expected that answer all along, which raised several questions Theron wasn't sure he wanted answers to. But instead of taking the dagger and leaving like a normal person who'd just had their concerns addressed, she stayed exactly where she was, standing near the wall where the heat from the forge softened into something almost comfortable. "Can I help you with something else?" he asked, trying to keep the confusion out of his voice and failing. "No. I just like watching competent people work." The statement landed in the space between them like a stone dropped in still water, and Theron found himself with absolutely no idea what to do with it. So he did what he always did when faced with things he didn't understand. He turned back to the forge and kept working. The axe head needed attention. The fire needed coal. Work was always the answer when questions got too complicated. Except she didn't leave. She just stood there, quiet and present, watching him move through the familiar motions of his craft. At first it made his shoulders tight, made him overly aware of every movement, every strike of the hammer, like performing for an audience he hadn't asked for. But as minutes stretched into an hour and the hour stretched toward 2, something strange happened. The tension eased. His hands found their rhythm again. And he started talking. Not to her, exactly. More like thinking out loud, the way he sometimes did when a problem needed working through. Explaining why he was adding flux, why the color of the metal mattered, why 3 strikes and not 4, why patience in the heating was worth more than speed. The words just came, filling the space she'd made by not filling it herself, and by the time he finished the axe head and set it aside to cool, He'd basically given her a full apprentice-level explanation of his entire process. She left sometime after that, slipping out with a quiet "thank you" that he almost missed over the sound of the fire, and it wasn't until the door closed behind her that Theron realized what he'd done. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the space where she'd been, feeling the forge settle back into its usual emptiness, except the emptiness felt different now. Louder, somehow. That night he stood in front of Myra's portrait and said, "She came back. I don't know why." The painted smile offered no theories. "I talked the whole time. Just rambled like an idiot. Still nothing." She didn't ask for any of it. She just listened. Something in his chest felt strange, not quite hope and not quite fear, but something that lived in the territory between them, something that felt dangerously close to wanting tomorrow to come. The visits became a pattern, which was either comforting or concerning depending on how Theron was feeling on any given morning, and he found himself unable to decide which. She arrived every few days with excuses that grew increasingly creative in their absurdity. Armor that smells off, even though armor definitionally did not have a smell beyond leather and metal and the general existence of being armor. A sword that sounds wrong when she swung it, which Theron tested extensively and found to sound exactly like every other sword he'd ever heard. A shield that feels heavier on one side, despite being perfectly balanced when he checked it 3 separate times with 3 separate methods because at that point he was just being thorough out of spite. Every inspection ended the same way. Nothing was wrong. Nothing needed fixing. She would nod like she'd expected exactly that answer, and then she'd stay, settling into her spot by the wall where the forge heat turned into something bearable, watching him work with the same patient attention she'd bring to a military briefing. And then the gift started. The first was a tool belt, appearing on his workbench one morning like it had manifested from thin air. Leather, hand-stitched with loops and pockets sized exactly right for every tool he used regularly, the craftsmanship so precise it made his own leatherwork look like a child's attempt. He picked it up, turned it over, found no note, no explanation. When she arrived later that day she just glanced at it and said, "You keep dropping things. Thought you could use it." He thanked her, genuinely pleased by the practicality, and set it carefully on the shelf near the forge where he kept things that were too nice to risk damaging. She watched him do this, her face unreadable, though he could have sworn something flickered behind her eyes. The next week brought a small clay jar, sealed with wax. "Salve," she said. "For burns." He opened it, smelled mountain herbs and something sharp he couldn't identify, thanked her again, and placed it on the shelf next to the belt. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Then came a carved wooden charm on a leather cord, intricate knotwork that must have taken hours. "Protection," was all she said. He admired it, complimented the craftsmanship, and added it to the growing collection on the shelf. She made a sound in the back of her throat that might have been frustration or might have been a cough. He couldn't tell. The 4th time she arrived, she was carrying a cloth-wrapped bundle that turned out to be food. Bread, cheese, some kind of spiced meat he didn't recognize. She set it on his workbench with more force than strictly necessary. "You work through meals," she said, and it sounded almost like an accusation. "I'm fine. You're thin. I'm efficient. You're malnourished. I'm managing my time well." She crossed her arms. "Same thing." He opened his mouth to argue, caught the look on her face, the absolute certainty that she was right and he was being an idiot, and found himself laughing instead. Actually laughing, not the polite chuckle he sometimes forced for customers but a real laugh that came from somewhere deep in his chest and surprised him with how rusty it sounded. He couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed like that. Months, probably. Maybe longer. Her entire expression changed. Softened in a way that made her look suddenly, unexpectedly vulnerable, like she'd just witnessed something she'd been hoping to see for a very long time. She didn't say anything, just watched him with an intensity that should have made him uncomfortable but instead made something warm unfold in the space below his ribs. He ate the food. All of it, right there while she watched, and it was the first meal he'd actually tasted in weeks instead of just mechanically consuming for fuel. When she left that evening, he caught himself wishing she'd stayed longer, which was a dangerous thought, the kind that led to expecting things, to wanting things, to the possibility of losing things. That night he arranged the gifts neatly on their shelf and told Myra's portrait, "She keeps bringing me things. I think it's an Orc custom. Hospitality, maybe." The painted face smiled its eternal smile. "She's just being kind," he added, as if the portrait had suggested otherwise. "People are kind sometimes." He touched the charm briefly, then pulled his hand back and went to bed, telling himself that tomorrow would be exactly like today, that nothing was changing, that he was fine with that. She'd been coming for 2 weeks when she finally asked about the portrait, and Theron realized with something like shame that he'd never actually introduced himself, never asked her name, never established any of the normal foundations of human interaction, because apparently he'd forgotten how those worked somewhere between year 3 and year 4 of talking exclusively to a painting. They were standing near the forge, him explaining something about grain structure in steel that she probably didn't need explained given how expertly she'd worked that first morning, when her gaze drifted up to the portrait above the workspace. Myra, frozen forever mid-laugh, dark hair catching light that no longer existed. "Who is she?" Cale asked, and her voice was careful in a way that suggested she already knew the answer would matter. Theron's hands stopped moving. Everything stopped moving. The question hung in the air between them like smoke, and he realized he'd been waiting for someone to ask this for 5 years and also desperately hoping no one ever would. "My wife," he said finally, and the words came out rougher than he'd intended. "Where is she now?" The directness of it, the complete absence of the careful dancing most people did around death, caught him off guard. No euphemisms. No softening. Just the question, clean and sharp as a blade. "Dead. 5 years. Plague." Cale nodded once, taking this in, and he waited for the usual responses. The apologies that meant nothing. The assurances that time healed all wounds, which was a lie time itself seemed determined to disprove. The awkward retreat from a topic that made everyone uncomfortable. Instead she asked, "Do you think she'd want you to stop living?" The question detonated something in his chest. Theron felt heat rise up his neck, felt his jaw clench so hard his teeth ached. "You don't know anything about her," he said, and his voice came out sharp enough to cut. "You don't get to stand in my forge and tell me what she'd want." "You're right," Cale said, and her voice stayed level, maddeningly calm in the face of his anger. "I don't know her. I never will. But I know what dying looks like, and I know the difference between honoring the dead and joining them. Get out. The dead don't need your loyalty, Theron." She used his name for the first time, and he didn't even remember telling it to her, which meant she'd asked someone else, which meant she'd been thinking about him enough to ask. "They're dead. They're past needing anything. They need you to live. To actually live, not just go through the motions of not being buried yet." I said get out. She looked at him for a long moment, and something in her expression was almost pitying, which somehow made it worse. Then she picked up her sword, the one that had sounded perfectly fine, and walked toward the door. She paused at the threshold, backlit by afternoon sun, and said quietly, "She loved you. That's obvious from how you look at her. Which means she'd be furious at what you've done to yourself." Then she was gone. Theron stood there shaking, his hands curled into fists, feeling something he hadn't felt in years. Not the cold, distant sadness that had become his constant companion. Not the numb going through motions emptiness. This was hot. Alive. Actual anger that burned in his veins and made his heart pound and reminded him that hearts were supposed to do more than just mechanically pump blood through a body that had forgotten why it was bothering. That night he didn't speak calmly to the portrait. He yelled at it. "She's wrong, right? You'd want me to remember you. You'd want me to keep everything exactly how it was. You'd want—" He trailed off, breathing hard, and in the silence that followed he heard it. Not out loud. Not really. But somewhere in the part of his mind that still held Myra's voice, still remembered how she sounded when she was exasperated with him, he heard her say with absolute clarity, "You absolute idiot." He sank onto the stool by his workbench and put his head in his hands, and for the first time since the funeral he cried. Not the silent, controlled tears he'd shed alone in the dark. These were ugly, gasping sobs that shook his whole body, and when they finally subsided he felt hollowed out and somehow, inexplicably, like he could finally breathe properly for the first time in 5 years. She didn't come back for 3 days after their fight, and Theron told himself he was relieved and also told himself he wasn't watching the door every time he heard footsteps outside, and also told himself a lot of other lies that fell apart the moment she finally walked back in carrying a shield that needed actual legitimate repair work this time, a dent in the boss that spoke of recent combat. "Bandits," she said by way of greeting, as if the argument had never happened. "Northern Pass." He took the shield, examined the damage, nodded. "I can fix this." "I know." And just like that, they fell into working side by side. She had her own project, something with a sword hilt that needed rewrapping, and she settled into her usual spot, except this time she pulled a stool closer to the workspace, close enough that they were occupying the same pool of firelight. The silence between them felt different than it had those first few visits. Not watching and being watched. More like two people who'd found a rhythm and were content to exist in it. He heated the shield boss, began the careful work of hammering the dent out from the inside, and found himself narrating again. "The trick is to work from the center outward. Otherwise you just move the problem around instead of actually solving it." "Like grief," she said, and he glanced up, startled by the observation. "Yeah, I guess like grief." They worked. At some point she handed him the smaller hammer before he'd even realized he needed it, and later he adjusted the fire without her asking because he could see she was getting too warm. The movements felt choreographed, as natural as breathing, like they'd been doing this for years instead of weeks. "Do you ever take a day off?" he asked, wiping sweat from his forehead. "From what?" "Fighting. Patrolling. Showing up at forges uninvited." "No. Rest is for the weak. Rest is for people who don't want to collapse from exhaustion." She looked at him, and there was something almost playful in her eyes. "Same thing." He laughed, shaking his head. "Do orcs not understand nuance? We understand it. We just don't respect it." "What about humility?" "Humility is for people who have things to apologize for." She said it with such absolute conviction that he laughed again, harder this time, and she smiled. Not the small polite smile she sometimes used. A real one that changed her entire face, made her eyes crinkle at the corners, and that was when he actually looked at her. Really looked. She had a scar running through her left eyebrow that made her look perpetually skeptical. Soot smudged across one cheek despite her best efforts to stay clean. Her hair was pulled back in a practical braid that was coming loose in places. When she laughed, genuinely laughed, there was nothing careful or controlled about it. It was full and warm and completely unguarded, and something in Theron's chest twisted sideways. She must have seen something change in his face because her expression shifted, became softer, more tentative. She set down the hilt she'd been working on and took a step closer, close enough that he could see the exact green of her eyes in the firelight. "Theron," she started, and his name in her mouth sounded like a question, like an offer, like the beginning of something he'd spent 5 years teaching himself not to want. Panic hit him like cold water. Everything in him screamed danger, risk, the possibility of loss, of feeling something that could be taken away. "Customer coming in an hour," he blurted out, stepping back, putting the anvil between them like a barricade. "Should probably finish this before they arrive." Her face closed. Not angry. Worse than angry. It went carefully, precisely blank, the way soldiers' faces did when they'd been hurt but refused to show it. She picked up her sword, the rewrapping only half finished, and moved back to her spot by the wall. The distance between them felt like miles now. They worked in silence for another 20 minutes, except this silence had teeth. When she finally left, she didn't say goodbye, didn't say anything, just walked out into the afternoon like she was retreating from a battlefield she'd just lost. That night Theron lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment over and over. The way she'd looked at him. The way she'd said his name. The way he'd flinched away from the first real connection he'd felt since Myra died. His chest ached with something that felt suspiciously like regret, and sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams of reaching for things that dissolved the moment his fingers got close. A week passed and she didn't come back, which was fine, obviously fine, perfectly fine, and Theron told himself this approximately 40 times a day while noticing her absence in every corner of the forge that had somehow become hers without his permission. The spot by the wall looked wrong, empty. The silence felt aggressive instead of peaceful. He finished orders with mechanical efficiency and felt no satisfaction from any of it, which wasn't new exactly but felt more pronounced now, like someone had turned up the volume on his own inadequacy. When she finally returned on the 8th day, Theron knew something was wrong before she even spoke. She moved differently, slower, like every step required deliberate thought. Her armor hung looser than it had, and there were shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there before. A bruise darkened her jaw, fresh enough that the edges were still angry red. "Northern Pass again," she said, answering his unasked question. "Bandits don't learn." She was carrying a sword that legitimately needed sharpening this time, but when she tried to set it on the workbench her hands shook just enough that the blade clattered against the wood harder than intended. She steadied it quickly, but not quickly enough that he missed the wince that crossed her face. "You should rest," he said before he could think better of it. "I'm fine. You look exhausted." "I look like someone who works for a living." There was an edge to her voice that was new, sharp enough to cut, and he recognized it as the sound of someone who was in pain and refusing to admit it. He'd made that sound himself often enough after Myra died, when people asked how he was doing and he'd insisted he was managing just fine. She stayed, because apparently stubbornness was a trait that transcended species, but this time she couldn't keep up the pretense of normal. 20 minutes into working she had to sit down, breathing harder than the work warranted. When she tried to lift a hammer her hand trembled badly enough that she set it back down with visible frustration. Theron watched all of this and felt something twist in his gut, something that might have been concern or might have been fear, and he opened his mouth to say something, anything, but the words tangled themselves before they could form. Because asking meant caring, and caring meant risk, and risk meant the possibility of loss, and he'd already used up his lifetime allotment of loss. So he said nothing. Just worked, pretending not to notice, and she sat there pretending to rest normally, and they both maintained the fiction that everything was exactly as it should be. She left earlier than usual, and he watched her go with the uncomfortable certainty that something was breaking and he had no idea how to fix it. The truth found him 2 days later in the form of old Marin, the town healer, who came by to pick up a set of surgical scissors he'd repaired. She was the kind of person who knew everyone's business and felt it was her civic duty to share that knowledge widely, usually whether you wanted to hear it or not. "Saw that orc warrior leaving here the other day," she said while examining the scissors. "The one who's been hanging around. She brings me work sometimes." Marin made a non-committal sound that suggested she had opinions about that. "Shame about the curse." Theron's hand stilled on the blade he'd been polishing. "What curse?" "The Ember Curse. Fire WYRM wound, nasty business. Burns you from the inside out, slow and steady. Nothing stops it, not orc medicine, not ours, not prayer." She shook her head. "She's got months at best. Saw the signs last time she came through for supplies. That's why she's still taking patrols, I'd wager. Warriors don't know how to stop fighting." She kept talking but Theron stopped hearing the words. The forge, the tools, the careful routine of his day, all of it dissolved into white noise as his mind reorganized everything he thought he knew. Every visit. Every absurd excuse about handles and smells and sounds. Every gift carefully chosen and carefully placed. Every hour she'd spent watching him work when she could have been anywhere else, doing anything else with whatever time she had left. She was dying. She'd been dying the entire time. And she'd spent her final months trying to pull him back from the edge of his own self-imposed grave, while he'd been too buried in the past to see her standing right in front of him, running out of future. His hands were shaking. The entire world was shaking. Marin said something else, probably goodbye, and left with her scissors, and Theron stood alone in his forge understanding with crushing clarity that he'd been given something precious and had been too much of a coward to reach for it. He found her 3 days later at the market, moving between stalls with the careful deliberation of someone conserving energy they no longer had in abundance. She was buying supplies, practical things like dried meat and bandages, the kind of provisions someone took on patrol, and the sight of her preparing for another dangerous assignment when she should have been resting, should have been anywhere but the front lines, made something snap in Theron's chest. He caught up to her between the spice merchant and the cloth vendor, grabbed her arm without thinking. "Why didn't you tell me?" She turned, and he saw the moment recognition hit, followed immediately by something that looked like resignation. She yanked her arm free with more force than necessary. "Tell you what? That you're dying." The words came out louder than he'd intended, and a few nearby shoppers glanced over with interest. He lowered his voice. "The Ember Curse. Why didn't you tell me?" She looked at him for a long moment, and then she laughed. It was a bitter, hollow sound that had nothing to do with humor. Would it have mattered? Of course it would have mattered. I would have. What? She stepped closer, and there was something fierce in her eyes now, something that had been held back until this moment. "What would you have done differently, Theron? Pitied me? Treated me like I was made of glass? You can barely handle talking to me when you think I'm healthy. What the hell would you have done if you'd known I was dying?" He opened his mouth and found he had no answer, because she was right and they both knew it. "You've been dead for 5 years, she continued, and her voice was getting louder now, months of patience finally breaking. "At least I have an excuse. I'm actually dying. What's yours?" She didn't wait for him to respond. "I thought if I was patient, if I just kept showing up, if I proved myself over and over again, you'd finally choose to live. That maybe seeing someone fight to stay in the world would remind you that being in the world was worth fighting for. But you don't want to live. You want to hide in that forge and pretend everything ended when she died. Don't talk about her like you understand." "I don't understand," Cale cut him off, and there was something raw in her voice now, something beyond anger. "I don't know her. I never will. But I know you're wasting a life she would have killed to have more of. I know you're so busy being loyal to a memory that you can't see anything real that's standing right in front of you." She paused, breathing hard, and when she spoke again her voice had dropped to something quieter, more devastating. "I've spent months trying to reach you. Bringing you things. Staying close. Waiting for you to ask one single question about me, about why I keep coming back, about anything that wasn't about metal or work or the past you're determined to live in. I didn't know what you wanted. I wanted you to want to know." She stepped back, and the fight seemed to drain out of her all at once, leaving only exhaustion in its wake. "I'm done, Theron. I have maybe 3 months left if I'm lucky, probably less, and I'm not spending them trying to convince someone that I'm worth their time. That I'm worth the risk of caring about. That I'm worth looking at as something more than just another person bringing work to your forge." She turned away, gathering her supplies, and he felt panic rising in his throat because this felt final in a way their previous arguments hadn't. "Cale, wait." "No." She didn't look back. "I waited. For months I waited. Now I'm done waiting." She walked away, moving through the market crowd with the kind of dignity that came from having nothing left to lose, and Theron stood there frozen, watching her go, his feet rooted to the ground like they'd forgotten how to move forward. Someone bumped into him, apologized, moved on. The market continued around him, people buying and selling and living their lives, completely unaware that his entire understanding of the last few months had just reorganized itself into something unbearable. She'd been dying. She'd been spending her last precious months trying to save him from himself. And he'd been so buried in his own grief that he'd let her do all the work of reaching while he stood still and called it loyalty. He didn't follow her. The crowd swallowed her up, and he stood there among the vegetables and fabrics and ordinary commerce, understanding that he'd just lost something irreplaceable and that this time it was entirely, completely, devastatingly his own fault. Theron worked for 3 days straight, barely sleeping, not eating, just hammering metal with a fury that should have produced something worthwhile but instead produced nothing but failure. Everything came out wrong. A blade too brittle, snapping during the quench. An axe head warped beyond saving. A sword that rang with the wrong tone when struck, the kind of flaw that spoke of fundamental errors in the forging. He'd been making weapons for 20 years and suddenly his hands had forgotten everything they'd ever known. On the 4th day he didn't even try to work. He just sat on the floor of the forge, staring at the shelf where her gifts lined up like accusations. The tool belt he'd never worn. The salve he'd never used. The charm he'd never carried. The food, long since eaten but the memory of it still sharp, the first real meal he'd tasted in months because she'd made him pay attention to the act of living instead of just surviving. He stood, legs unsteady, and took down the bracelet. The first gift? The one she'd brought weeks ago, leather carefully worked and stitched with a precision that spoke of hours of labor. He'd thanked her politely and put it on the shelf and never looked at it again, never wondered why someone would spend that kind of time on something meant for a stranger's wrist. He turned it over in his hands and saw for the first time what he'd missed in his careful, deliberate blindness. An engraving on the inside, letters carved with the same precision as the stitching. Not common. Something else. He grabbed his coat and walked to the jeweler 3 streets over, the bracelet clutched in his fist like evidence of a crime he'd committed without realizing. Old Henrik took one look at the inscription and raised his eyebrows. Orcish. Haven't seen this dialect in years. Where'd you get this? What does it say? Henrik squinted, tilting the leather toward the light. For the man who taught me that being seen is worth dying for. He looked up at Theron with sudden understanding. Someone made this for you? Theron couldn't speak. The words had taken all the air out of the room, out of his lungs, out of the careful structure he'd built to keep feeling at a manageable distance. He took the bracelet back, mumbled something that might have been thanks, and walked out into the street feeling like the ground had turned to water beneath his feet. That night he sat in front of Myra's portrait for a long time, just looking at her frozen smile, her forever laugh, trying to remember what her voice had sounded like when she was disappointed in him. It took a while, but eventually it came back, sharp and clear. I love her, he said to the painting. I'm in love with an orc warrior who's dying, who spent months trying to reach me while I hid behind your memory like a coward. His voice cracked. And I let her walk away. I let her think she wasn't worth fighting for. You'd be so angry at me right now. The portrait said nothing, but in his memory, in the part of his mind that still held her voice perfectly preserved, he heard Myra say with absolute exasperated clarity, "You absolute idiot. Go get her." He stood, put on the bracelet, felt the leather warm against his skin like it had been waiting all this time. He looked around the forge, at the cold hearth, at the tools hung in their precise places, at the routine he'd built to keep himself from having to choose anything beyond survival. Then he walked upstairs, grabbed supplies he'd need for travel, came back down and left the forge without lighting the fire. The door closed behind him with a sound like finality. For the first time in 5 years, the forge sat cold and empty, and Theron was somewhere else, moving toward something instead of away from it, choosing risk over safety, choosing the terrifying possibility of more loss over the certainty of never having anything worth losing again. The stable master looked at him like he'd asked to borrow a dragon. You want a horse? Yes. You, Theron the blacksmith, who I've never seen further than 3 streets from his forge in 5 years, want to borrow a horse? Yes. Can you ride? I'll figure it out. The stable master sighed the sigh of someone who knew he was watching a disaster unfold but was too tired to stop it, and led him to a grey mare who took one look at Theron and immediately conveyed through body language alone that she found him personally offensive. She's temperamental, the stable master warned. But she's steady on rough terrain. Theron mounted with all the grace of a sack of potatoes being thrown over a fence, and the mare made a sound that suggested she was reconsidering every life choice that had led to this moment. They made it out of town at a pace that could generously be called glacial, and Theron tried not to think about how much time he was losing, how many days Cale might not have, how the clock had been ticking this entire time and he'd been too buried in his own past to hear it. He stopped at the first border outpost 12 hours later, his entire body screaming from muscles he hadn't known existed. The guard on duty looked him over with barely concealed amusement. Lost? Looking for someone. Orc commander. Female. Takes the dangerous patrols, the long routes. The guard's amusement faded into something more serious. The one with the death wish. Yeah, she came through 4 days ago. Headed for Widow's Pass. Where's that? 3 days north through territory that's been nothing but bandits and worse for the last month. The guard studied him. You're not military. You're not a fighter. What business do you have at Widow's Pass? I need to find her. You'll die. Probably. The guard stared at him for a long moment, then shook his head with the weary recognition of someone who'd seen this story before. This is about a woman, isn't it? Yes. Figures. He pulled out a rough map, marked the route. Stay on the main road until you see the split oak. Then north until the river crossing. After that you're on your own. Don't die stupidly. Die heroically. Better story. Theron took the map and rode on into territory that got progressively more hostile with every mile. He saw signs of recent fighting. Burned wagons. Abandoned camps. Once, a patrol of soldiers who eyed him with suspicion but let him pass when he explained he was looking for the Orc commander, because apparently everyone knew about her, about the warrior taking suicide missions like they were routine assignments. He slept under stars that felt accusatory, lying on ground that was too hard and too cold, and when he finally managed to fall asleep he dreamed of the forge. Of Kale standing in the firelight, handing him tools before he asked, moving through his space like she belonged there. He dreamed of all the moments he'd missed because he'd been too afraid to look directly at something that might matter, too terrified of the possibility that letting someone in meant eventually watching them leave. On the third day he was exhausted, starving, and reasonably certain the horse had been planning his murder since approximately hour 2 of their acquaintance. His legs ached. His back screamed. Every part of him that could hurt did hurt, and some parts he hadn't known could hurt had decided to join the chorus. But he kept riding because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant facing the possibility that he was too late, that she'd already gone somewhere he couldn't follow. One thought drove him forward, a prayer or a promise or maybe just desperation given words. I see you now. I'm sorry it took me so long. I see you now. Please, please let me not be too late. Widow's Pass earned its name. Theron understood that the moment he crested the final ridge and saw what lay below. Bodies scattered across the narrow mountain passage, some in the rough leather of bandits, others in the uniform of border guards, all of them very thoroughly dead. Smoke still rose from a supply wagon that had been set ablaze, and the air tasted of blood and ash and recent violence. He dismounted, legs nearly giving out, and moved through the carnage on foot, checking faces with a growing dread that sat like ice in his chest. Not her. Not her. Not her. Please not her. And then he saw movement near a boulder at the pass's narrowest point, a shift of green against grey stone, and his heart stopped and restarted in the same breath. Kale was slumped against the rock, her armor cracked in 3 places, blood staining the leather dark. Her sword was planted in the ground beside her like a gravestone marker, and her eyes were closed. He ran, or tried to run, his exhausted body managing something between a jog and a controlled fall. Kale. Her eyes opened, unfocused at first, then sharpening with visible effort. Theron? She said his name like she thought she might be hallucinating. What the hell are you doing here? He fell to his knees beside her, hands hovering over her injuries, not knowing where to touch that wouldn't cause pain. I came to tell you something. If it's an apology, save it. I'm too tired to be angry. But there was no heat in the words, just bone-deep exhaustion and something that might have been resignation. It's not an apology. He took her hand, the one that wasn't pressed against her ribs, and held it like it was the only thing keeping him anchored to the earth. I see you. I'm sorry it took me so long. I'm sorry I made you do all the work of reaching while I stood still and called it loyalty. But I see you now, Kale. I see you, and I love you. Her breath hitched. Tears started sliding down her face, cutting tracks through the dirt and blood. I'm dying, Theron. The curse is faster now. Weeks, maybe less. I don't have time for this to be something worth having. Then let me love you anyway. He leaned forward, resting his forehead against hers, feeling her warmth, the too hot fever heat of the curse burning through her. However long we have. A week. A day. An hour. Let me choose you. Let me be there. Let me matter to you the way you mattered to me before I was brave enough to admit it. She was crying harder now, and he was crying too, ugly graceless tears that he'd spent 5 years not allowing himself. You're an idiot, she whispered. I know. You waited until I was dying to figure this out. I know. You're the worst. I know. She pulled him closer with what strength she had left and kissed him, and it tasted like smoke and salt and blood and desperation and something that might have been hope. When she pulled back she was smiling through the tears, and he thought he'd never seen anything more beautiful than this dying warrior who decided he was worth her last months of life. Okay, she said. You can love me. But you have to carry me back down this mountain because I think I broke 3 ribs and possibly something in my left leg. He laughed, the sound half sob. I can do that. She studied his face, her smile growing slightly. Did that horse bite you? He touched his arm where the mare had gotten him on day 2. Yes. You're such a disaster. I'm your disaster now. Yeah. She reached up, touched his face with her good hand, her expression soft in a way he'd never seen before. You are. So let's go home before I bleed out and make this whole dramatic rescue pointless. He gathered her as carefully as he could, feeling her wince despite his best efforts, and started the long walk back down the mountain toward the horse who definitely hated him, carrying the woman who'd spent her dying months trying to teach him how to live. The sun was setting behind them, painting the pass in golden red, and for the first time since Myra died, Theron felt like he was moving toward something instead of just away from everything. They had 87 days. Theron counted each one like a miser counting gold, hoarding the hours, stretching the moments as thin as they'd go before they broke. She moved into the room above the forge, the one he'd kept frozen as a shrine to Myra, and they filled it with new life. Orc songs that she taught him in the evenings, her voice going rough on the high notes. Reading lessons where he stumbled through books she'd always wanted to understand, his finger tracing under words while she corrected his pronunciation. Arguments about tempering technique that got heated enough that they'd forget she was dying and he was grieving and they were just two craftspeople who disagreed about proper forge temperature. On day 12 she taught him a drinking song that was mostly about a warrior who'd gotten drunk and challenged a bear to single combat. He was terrible at it, couldn't carry a tune to save his life, but he tried anyway and she laughed so hard she had to sit down. He memorized that laugh, stored it somewhere deep where grief couldn't touch it. Day 34 found them in the room upstairs, him reading from A History of Human Kingdoms while she fell asleep on his shoulder, her breathing evening out into something peaceful. He kept reading anyway, his voice low, because he'd learned by then that she slept better when there was sound, when she wasn't alone with whatever dreams the curse brought. Day 56 was the day she couldn't lift the hammer anymore. She tried, her face setting with determination, but her hands shook too badly and the weight that had once been nothing to her might as well have been a mountain. He saw her frustration, saw her about to apologize for weakness that wasn't weakness at all, and moved behind her. Together then, he said, and wrapped his hands over hers, guiding them through one more strike. The metal sang, and she smiled. Day 73 she couldn't get out of bed. The curse had moved into her lungs, her legs, burning through her from the inside with increasing speed. So he brought the forge to her in stories. Told her about the orders he was working on, the customers who came through, the gossip the baker's daughter had shared. Described the color of the metal as it heated, the sound of the quench, the way the shop cat had somehow gotten into the forge and knocked over an entire rack of files. She listened with her eyes closed, squeezing his hand when the pain got bad, and he talked until his voice went hoarse because silence felt like giving up. Day 87 dawned cold and clear. She woke before sunrise, which was unusual lately, and took his hand with more strength than she'd had in days. Theron. I'm here. Thank you. Her voice was barely a whisper. For seeing me. For choosing me. For these days. Don't. His voice broke. Don't say goodbye yet. Not goodbye. She smiled, and it was the same smile she'd given him that first morning in the forge, confident and a little fierce. Just thank you. She closed her eyes. He felt her hand go slack in his. He sat there holding her as the sun rose, as the forge below stayed cold, as the world continued turning without her in it, and for the second time in his life he understood what it meant to lose someone who'd made the world make sense. 3 weeks later he stood at the forge, working metal that glowed white-hot, folding her ashes into steel the way orc warriors did for their honored dead. The blade took him 5 days to complete, and when it was finished it was the finest thing he'd ever made. Fierce and beautiful and strong, just like her. He hung it above the workspace, right next to Myra's portrait. 2 women who'd taught him in different ways that being alive meant choosing to feel things even when feeling hurt. The door opened. He looked up expecting a customer and found instead a young orc woman, maybe 16, holding a dagger with an embarrassed grip. I heard you take apprentices, she said, nervous and hopeful in equal measure. Theron looked at her and saw Kale in the set of her shoulders, in the way she stood like she was ready to fight for what she wanted. He saw all the young people who'd come after Kale was gone, all the ones who'd need teaching, all the ways he could keep living, keep choosing, keep honoring both the women who'd saved him from himself. Yeah, he said, and smiled for the first time since day 87. I do. Let's see that dagger. The forge roared back to life, filled with new voices, new stories, new choices made every day. Above it all, two portraits watched. One painted. One forged in steel. Both smiling. And that's where we're leaving Theron. Not in the grave he built for himself, but in the forge, teaching, living, choosing every day to honor both the women who taught him that grief and love aren't opposites, they're companions. Before you go, I need you to do 3 things. 1. Smash that like button because this story took days to craft and your support literally makes more stories like this possible. 2. Subscribe and turn on notifications because we're building something real here, a community that isn't afraid of complicated emotions. And 3. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And here's the question I want you to sit with: if you knew you only had 87 days left, what would you stop waiting for? What would you finally choose? I'll be reading every single comment, every answer, because your stories matter just as much as Theron's. Now go live like someone's counting your days. Because someone is. It's you.